will brief you
How you doing?
a lot
A lot, okay.
if you want it. Hey, I might miss some television coverage. Let me see if your hair's okay. Yeah, don't push your glasses up because when you do, it messes your hair up. So since we're gonna be on TV a lot, you don't need to do that.
I told her my mic's on. I told her my mic's on. Be careful what she says. Huh? I don't know. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Rules Committee. This is a little bit different than what we normally do because normally we are considering legislation that's already passed a committee in the House, and we are considering it for whether it should be placed on the floor of the House for a floor vote or not. But today we are going to be tasked with acting as a standing committee to evaluate a bill that has been assigned to this committee. And that bill is Senate Bill 131. And so it will not be your typical Rules Committee meeting where we hear briefly from authors of bills. This will be a hearing on a bill. And Senator Burt Jones is going to present the bill. And then he has one witness that is going to speak on as to the bill, and that's Dale Cardwell. And then we will hear from two witnesses for the city of Atlanta, and that is Robert Highsmith. Where are you? All right, Robert Highsmith and John Selden. Mr. Selden. And then we will hear from various members of the committee to discuss the bill and a possible substitute to the bill. So that is going to be the process we're going to go through. And so first of all, I would ask Senator Jones, if he will, to come and present the bill and tell us a little bit about the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee members, for being here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to present Senate Bill 131. I know it's been a bill that's been heavily talked about during the session and also in the off-season, particularly on the Senate side. I know there's quite a few House members that don't have all the details about what all went into place when the Senate Study Committee talked about Senate Bill 131 or the potential of Senate Bill 131. So if you indulge me for a little bit, Mr. Chairman, I will give you a little brief history on what we did, what we found, and what has brought us to this point in time right now. Last year, I guess we, for decades, you know, if you have done business in the city of Atlanta, if you've lived in the city of Atlanta, gone to school in the city of Atlanta, or anywhere really in Georgia, there's always been an underlying current about, or a suspicion about activities that is involved the airport. And since I've been in the legislature, you continue to hear those type of activities. And I guess with the last couple years, particularly with one of your old colleagues, who's the U.S. Attorney's Office now, B.J. Pack, been putting forth an investigation, we have had a constant flow of reports, indictments, things of that nature that have taken place during this time frame. Now, when I introduced the bill last year in the Senate, I just doing a brief look at what all would need to go in to looking at what is the problem at the city hall or at the airport. Why do we keep having these activities that keep rearing their heads? I saw very quickly that one legislative session was not going to be efficient to try to answer all those questions. So we changed it to a Senate study committee, and we tried to be very fair and diligent in our process. We had a study committee made up of 13 members of veteran legislators, 8 Republicans and 5 Democrats. And the essential part of our goal was to go on a fact-finding mission during the off season. The airport is a very vital entity. It's the one that has helped drive the economy for the state of Georgia for many, many years, and we are proud of it. But that kind of activity that has gone on for several decades now is really embarrassing for the state, and should be embarrassing for the city as well. So we formed the committee, a 13-person committee, and we met with aviation consultants, we met with bond attorneys, we had the city of Atlanta there, and their attorney, I'm sure you'll hear from later today, and the new general manager and the new procurement officer. And so we've tried to allow them as much time to present their case. I spoke with current vendors, past vendors. I spoke with past general managers. I spoke with current city council members as well as the mayor's office. And I met with several past city council members as well. So the committee, I think, and I was very proud of the work that we did on the committee. We looked at, like I said, the bond obligations, the lease obligations. We looked at something similar that took place in North Carolina with the Charlotte Airport. And also I do have the findings from our study committee is in your packet if you don't have enough to read already on day 38 here. But at any rate, so at the conclusion of all these, having bond attorneys, having the city officials, having aviation consultants, having investigative reporters, and all the various people that we had to come and testify to our committee, we put together a report. And in that report, the findings of it, like I said, it's on your desk if you'd like to look at it. The findings of that report, that there was enough evidence and there was enough concern and justification for us to move forward with legislation. Now, as I told you before, that was a 8 Republicans, 5 Democratic committee. We had 12 members that were present that day, and there was a unanimous vote to move forward on legislation. A unanimous vote. So for once, we were able to put politics aside and just let the facts take us and listen to the facts and see exactly where the issue was. Now, coming to the issue, that we were very fortunate in the first meeting that we had a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Bell, who worked for the Maynard-Jackson administration. He worked in City Hall. He worked for at the airport. He was a person that worked in the city in the late 70s and early 80s, and was very familiar about how the framework or the structural framework was created from many, many years ago. And after his tenure there with the city, he went on and got his PhD from the University of Georgia. And in his dissertation, he in 1982, whatever it was, in his dissertation for his PhD program, he stated that moving forward for long-term benefits for the state as a whole, it would be in the best interest of the state of Georgia to look at an authority-based structure for Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. And the reason why he cited that was because of the political activities or the political mischief that went on even way back almost 40 years ago. He saw the concerns then, and he almost he was prophesied what he saw was coming in the future. And then, like I said, in front of you, you have a booklet here of every in investigation, indictment, prison time that has taken place since 1990, and this is 3 inches thick. It's double-sided, and the issues, the bad news that continues, and it will continue until us as either elect officials try to change the structural framework of that of the way it's being operated right now. I maintain that one elected official inside a city government was probably a fine structure when it was just a old racetrack and Delta Airlines was a crop dusting company. But as it has grown into what it is today, that structure, like a lot of businesses, I mean, this is not abnormal to change the structure of operation. Perfect example is a Chick-fil-A operation. Well, it started out as a little burger joint in Hateville, Georgia, but as it has grown into the enterprise that it is today, they've had to change the structural makeup and also the hierarchy of that makeup. So I think that it is a structural flaw by having one elected official be in charge of procurement, be in charge of general manager, and those individuals always having to answer to that individual. And I think that it should be changed. I think it's in the best interest of the airport. And let me be fair. I have proposed this. It's been made people to believe in the media that this is a takeover. What this is trying to change the management structure, and it could easily be done in a city-state manner. It could be easily done in a county, city-state manner, whatever it is. But throughout the process, I've never had anyone propose anything different than what is going on today. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I know there's going to be plenty of questions. I know there's plenty of questions on a variety of topics that I'll be happy to field and happy to answer. But I think as public officials, if you do know about criminal activity that has taken place, it's on a regular basis, and if we do not do anything about it, we just let it continue on, then we're party to the crime, basically. So I think it'd be in the best interest for the state. I'm open for proposals from this body. Obviously, I know the Senate doesn't have all the answers, but this is the proposal. The proposal, let me get to the actual framework of the bill here. The framework of the bill is basically, it's a structure of an authority that's modeled similar to the airport, similar to the Ports Authority and similar to the World Congress Center Authority. And it is essentially just a authority framework that gives the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, the majority of the picks, and looking at FAA, if they're going to make a switch from one entity to the next, then they will have to have something, another entity in place in order to take it. So, like I said, I know there's going to be plenty of questions, and I know my time is limited. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Assuming that the city of Atlanta were resistant to the transfer of the airport to an authority, how would you go about getting that transfer accomplished?
Well, you would go to the FAA and basically you would present your case of why this is appropriate to happen. Now, the case is being played out in front of us right now. You've got a current FAA probe going on. You have a current U.S. Attorney's investigation that is going on that just delivered a indictment of a longtime vendor a couple weeks ago, and you just had a FAA audit that they picked the Atlanta airport as an entity that they want to audit in the last 7 years of activities that have gone on. So there's evidence of misappropriations of funds. The way the FAA regulates the airport, just so everybody understands, Mr. Chairman, if you may allow me to do this, there's no dollars from a general fund perspective. The FAA prohibits an entity from being able to capitalize on the revenue dollars that it creates. All dollars are supposed to stay at the airport, at the facility in and of itself. And misappropriation of those dollars can cause a fine or penalty or some pretty heavy sanctions from the FAA themselves. So the notion that this is a boondoggle or a golden goose for the city of Atlanta is just not the case. There's no general obligation bonds that have been committed to the airport. The taxpayers of the city of Atlanta have not been obligated by the airport. The airport has funded itself through revenue bonds, and there's no obligations that have been put on the citizens of Atlanta. Essentially, what has happened, though, is it's been used as a political tool to fund political infrastructures and campaigns and friends and vendors and things of that nature.
Assuming all of that's true,
Yes, sir.
though, the question is, if they don't want the authority to be the owner of the airport, how do you effectuate a transfer?
What happens is there has to be a local decision agreement, I guess, so to speak, made. We do have in our code, in Georgia law, the Constitution, and I'll cite the code under roads, bridges, and ferries. I think it's 32-9-3. It gives the General Assembly, and which, if you had authority, it would be a state backed by the state of Georgia, has the ability, just like DOT does, for condemnation if we so had to go that route.
Well, that's what I want to know, is that if they do not voluntarily agree, is your only recourse a condemnation, which is a taking?
Yes, you're correct.
All right, and if we were to exercise eminent domain to take the airport from the city of Atlanta, how much would it cost us?
Well, because as I stated earlier before, your revenue bonds have been, and revenue bonds, DOT grants, and federal grants have been the mechanism which has funded the airport. Now, when you take possession of something that that, number one, we need to have some sort of illustration about what's been invested in it. Where is the actual dollars from the citizens of Atlanta that has been invested in the real estate in and of itself? And that is what I would want to know, because essentially, the best I can see, we don't have any indication that any dollars from the general fund have been spent on the airport. So
wait. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
You're telling me that if I go out and I borrow $100,000 from the bank to start a business, and then I use the revenue from that business to pay back the debt so that I've never paid anything out of pocket, and if DOT comes and takes all of my land, that I'm not entitled to anything because I've not invested any personal funds? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you're a private individual. The city of Atlanta is an agent of the state of Georgia, created by the state of Georgia, by this General Assembly. The other aspect that you could look at, Mr. Chairman, is by the revenue that it generates for the city. What are the gains? You're talking about buying a piece of business. When you look at a real estate, you look at a property that is a revenue-producing property, you would look at those gains about how productive it is and then evaluate it from there. Well, the revenues that are created there are essentially have to stay because of FAA regs at the airport itself. So the negotiation, I believe, would come to the improvements to the actual property itself, and also, once again, it'd have to be some sort of indication or have to have an illustration about what has been invested, what has the taxpayers of the city of Atlanta been obligated for, and it would be up to the city to be able to provide us with that information. You're not going to have any comps or anything to compare it to.
All right, let me ask you one more question, and
Yes,
then
sir.
I think we've got a few from the committee. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is the FAA will not approve a transfer unless both parties agree to it. Is that correct?
Well, they said that they put forth a rule in 2013 that they wanted both parties to agree. But that was under the current situation where they had a dispute between Charlotte and North Carolina, and they just did not act one way or the other.
But has the rule adopted in 2013 been changed?
No, sir, it's still in effect.
So that's still in effect. Thank you. Chairman Tanner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. First of all, I want to thank you for taking on this issue, because I think most of us would agree that there are issues at the airport. We can't help but watch and see that play out on the news. My concern, and to echo what Chairman Powell said, is there's so many unknowns about a full takeover of the airport, what the FAA would allow and not allow, what the cost would be if the city didn't agree to it and we had to go through a condemnation process. We're going down a very long, very possibly very expensive road with a lot of unknowns. But I was happy to hear you say, because I don't disagree something needs to be done, and I was happy to hear you say that you might be open to other thoughts, ideas, and suggestions, because I think by working together on this issue, we can come up with something that might be what I like to say a measured response that will get us in a better place than we are today without all the concerns and unknowns. So as we move through this process today and in the next few days, I look forward to us working closely together to try to come up with what that would look like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no pride in authorship, I can assure you. I'm open to suggestions from this body, by all means.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admittedly, my airport in Hinesville is a wee bit smaller than the one we're dealing with, but I do have a two-part question. My first question is, you mentioned that there is going to be an opening of an audit by FFA and FDA. My question is, the first part of my question is, over the last 20 years, has there been any fines related to misappropriation of funds at the airport of any kind? That's the first part of my question. The second part is, you mentioned in answering the chairman that it was a government entity and basically there's no loss. And I know one's private, one's public, but our president has said that his name is worth $1 billion. Are you saying the largest airport in the world and the prestige of having it is worth nothing?
Well, what I'm saying, Representative, is that the airport has been paid for through revenue bonds. And that means that you and I, and when we have gone through the airport, and every other Georgian here in the state of Georgia has gone through the airport, and all the customers, the billions of customers around the world, they've helped pay for the airport. It's an asset that while Atlanta, I know, has it and it has title to it, it's an asset that has benefited all Georgians and travelers from around the world. So whatever, if something were to occur and we got into a situation where we felt like it warranted some sort of oversight, it would be up to the city to be able to provide us with the information of what they actually have invested in it. Not the revenue bonds that have been issued on paper, not the DOT grants that have been issued, nor the federal grants. Federal airports, or actually most all airports, are heavily financed by federal grants and federal dollars. And then there's usually a state and a local match. However, I have been unable to find where those exist for the city itself.
The first part of my question, sir, you answered. Over the last 20 years, what sanctions or fines have been leveled? When you mentioned an audit coming up as if there might be problems, can you state any that has happened as a result of an audit?
I mean, we've got a current investigation going right now about over $10 million that was paid to a law firm that the last mayor was a former employee of, and and there's no indication that those dollars, other than the one line billing that says airport use, there's no real information of what they actually did to earn those fees at the airport.
I'm sorry.
But you
didn't answer my question.
To answer your question about the fines, I have read, I can't cite exactly where it is, but I have read where there have been fines. I don't know if it's been in the last 10, 20, or 30 years, but I could look for that for you,
I
Representative.
appreciate you sharing it with me.
Yeah.
All right.
Representative Carson. Try David Knights. Leader Trammell, it's not just you.
Yeah, I'm with you, Bob. Thank you, Senator Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. I had a question in regard to the revenue bonds at the airport. I understand that the bonds, as of about a year ago, total indebtedness was around $2.8, $2.9 billion. Can you talk a little bit about the work your study committee did, understanding the transferability of those bonds and that they're secured by the revenue? These are revenue bonds, and it's my understanding as well, Senator, these bonds do not affect the state borrowing limit because it's under authority. Can you talk a little bit more about the transfer of those bonds?
Yes, and the representative, you are correct in that. We had several experts. As you can probably imagine, the aviation bond community is a very small group of people, and we had one. There's several here in Atlanta, but most of them are from outside the state. But gentlemen, we did have come and testify on behalf of educating the committee about how the revenue bonds would work. It's essentially tied and underwritten by the airports, and when I say airports, I'm talking about the airlines, the concessionaires, the parkings. Is underwritten by its ability to produce the dollars that is insured for, basically. And if a FAA transfer did occur, then the bonds could be transferred with the underlying exposure. Now, if it's going from one government entity to the next, there would be, if it was going from a city entity to a private enterprise of some sort, but that's not what we're talking about. But if it was going from one government entity to the next, they could be transferred to that entity.
And we would just, as a state creating authority, we would need an opinion from bond counsel in regard to this, as well as to make sure we don't jeopardize the tax-exempt status of those bonds, correct?
That's correct. I mean, you would want to get an aviation expert, bond expert in to look at that. And even though I have a lot of confidence in the gentleman who testified in front of us, and he's very well thought of in that community. Yeah, you'd obviously want to get a second opinion on it.
My other question was in regard to the FAA audit. I think Representative Williams and your dialogue just now with Representative Williams covered that a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the revenue diversion that was discussed? How long has this been going on and so forth? Is it difficult to tell at this point? Because I understand from FAA rules and regs, there are civil penalties, grants can be withheld, so forth. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's
And those are grants under the AIP, the Airport Improvement
that's right, yeah.
Program.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way of telling how many dollars have been, misappropriated, because obviously it's within one city government structure. So there's really no way of knowing. I mean, as recently as I think last week, we saw where our current administration ordered to have staffers, before she actually took office, staffers put on payroll. One was put on payroll, and the title that was given to that individual was Deputy General Manager of the airport at a small price tag, about $275,000. So how you track, or how you could go about tracking where all those dollars or what payrolls those dollars are covering, it would have to have an audit by the FAA. And so I think I appreciate your question, but there's just no way for me to be able to give a good answer, because there's, like I said, there's one as recently as last week that's come forward.
And a final question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that the airport capital improvements, when we're talking about the investment at Hartsfield Jackson, that investment is primarily done in 3 areas. And just correct me if I'm wrong. It's the federal dollars from the FAA AIP program that's for grants for expansion, capital improvements, and so forth. Second would be GDOT grants through our aviation grants. And third would be the PFCs, that's the passenger facility charges, and the customer facility charges. In other words, user fees, and we call it junk fees when we buy an airline ticket, and junk fees when we rent a car from the airport. Those are the primary funding mechanisms for the airport, not City of Atlanta revenues, correct?
That's right. Didn't come out of the general fund.
Thank you, Senator.
Chairman Knight.
To the gentleman, one last question.
Yes, sir.
In talking about possible infractions in regards to these FAA rules and the funding that we're up under, going upon, let's assume that there are some significant findings, in the audits and in the current investigations. Does that play against us as a state and our general aviation program, or overall? How would that affect our state's standing with the FAA? Do you know? I'm curious if that may affect us as a state.
Yeah, Representative, I don't know. You would hope they treat each individual issue, as it sits. But obviously, it's you've got the world's busiest airport, and you have a FAA probe currently going on, and a U.S. Attorney's Office current investigation going on, and there's a pattern that has seemed to be in place for several decades now. So, at any rate, you hope it doesn't affect your regional airports.
Representative Hughley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the Senator, I heard you say that this was not a takeover, but when I look at the new structure, all of the appointments are going to be made by entities other than the city of Atlanta. So how do you reconcile that for me?
That came forward, as I said earlier, you know, in having direct conversations with the city, both in the mayor's office and the city council, and with Clayton County. I mean, let's be honest. We've had this airport sits in two different jurisdictions in Fulton and Clayton County, and several municipalities. So, but in talking with people who would have an interest, you know, meaning the city, meaning Clayton County, and obviously the state, I put forth an offer of, you know, let's do a joint authority, and never got anywhere with it, just to be honest with you. And so I don't know how I'll present anything other than this piece of language when I had no willing participants on the other two fronts. So
that's why it's considered a takeover, I guess. Secondly, with the current investigation going on from the FAA, why would we not wait until we see what they're going to come up with before we move forward with this, not knowing what the outcome of that would be?
Well, I mean, you got a current U.S. attorney's investigation going on. You've had several indictments. You've had people who have gone to prison, procurement officers, city employees have cut plea deals. It seems to be just working up the food chain. So I think we're being proactive in moving forward on legislation right now because, I mean, how much more bad news do we want to see?
Well, my final question to you, sir, would be the fact that it is true that there is a relatively new mayor, and are we saying that we're holding her administration responsible for these 10, 20 years of abuses at the airport as you described them?
You know, I was hoping with the new administration that there would, you know, and having met with her a few times and we had very nice conversations, didn't agree on the subject matter, but, you know, we're fine in chatting with one another. I was hoping this might be an opportunity to put forth a different structure when you had a new administration. And I've given the current mayor a pass during this process and been very, you know, I've had no ill correspondence about the mayor, but given the recent the allegations, I guess, of particularly with the staffers who were brought on board and put a couple or maybe one or two, I don't know, I think it was just one, put on the payroll at the airport. And the quote that I hear from on the AJC was, well, we really just don't know how it happened. This is just the way we've always done it, you know. And I don't know how you ignore things like that. Even though I was initially trying to exclude her from these talking points, but here the recent week-long. In fact, this morning I think the city council passed a resolution. I think it's a unanimous resolution asking for a investigation into those allegations, and the mayor vetoed them. Said they were going to do it internally. So I don't know why you would do that if it was simply just an honest mistake.
Representative Smyrie.
How you doing, Mr. Chairman? I'm over here.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, how are you? Where are you? I don't see, oh, there you are. Hey.
Okay.
Hey.
I just had a few questions. We've talked a lot, you and I, in fact, attended most of your meetings of the Senate Study Committee. In fact, at one time, I thought about authoring a House Study Committee and kind of thrashing it out that way and see what we could do after traveling the state and listening as well. But since we're at this juncture, and I know you've talked to the mayor on several occasions, as I have and others have. You are aware of her transparency citywide group that she's putting together to look at
Yes, sir.
city government in its entirety.
Yes, sir.
Not only Hartsfield, but the city government in its entirety. Do you think that's a step in the right direction?
Oh, I applaud that effort. Don't get me wrong, just like the council president, Felicia Moore, who's been on the city council for 20 years, I believe, I applaud her efforts. I think for years she has been a person who is, talking about the council president, someone who has always been willing to call out things that she didn't think was right or didn't believe in. So the only problem is we have, I think, well intentions on some fronts, and on other fronts, actions usually speak louder than words. And right now we have I feel like a structural flaw that continues to has the same type of issues that have plagued administration after administration. So while I applaud the appearance of those things, you have to question things that have recently come to light.
I've served with 7 mayors of Atlanta, and I've seen them run the airport. In fact, my recent study tells me that the 3 best run airports in America are run by cities, and the 3 worst airports in America are run by authorities. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a mixture. There's about half that are run by authorities, and as you look at the top 50 airports around the country, about I think 22 are some sort of city structure, and then 26, I believe, are authorities. Could be reverse. What the gauge that takes place as far as how they view airports, efficiencies and abilities to operate is in the takeoff and landings. A lot of it has to do with the airlines themselves and the cost per passenger. Obviously, we've got a great company in Delta Airlines that makes sure that the takeoff and landing number is very efficient, and they've done a good job with that. Also, the cost of per passenger is second in the country, Atlanta, but it has a lot to do with the connector. The fewer times you have to touch a passenger, the less it's going to cost you. And they're only, per passenger, they're only outdone by one city, and that's Charlotte. But Charlotte just happens to be the one city that has more transit activity. So there's what you're asking, there is a mixed bag on both authorities and municipalities, but a lot of those municipalities are in our authority structure.
This is my last one, Mr. Chairman, but you mentioned that the ongoing investigations, and of course we know that we've had them not only in Atlanta but all across the state if you just pick up a newspaper or watch a TV program. If there were not any ongoing investigation, are you saying there would be no need for a takeover?
If there was not an ongoing investigation and years of evidence of indictments and prison times and all that thing, we wouldn't have anything to talk about.
And then the last point, your description of a takeover. You said, how did you describe a takeover? You said that
I've referenced it as a new management structure, and treat the airport as a business enterprise that has an arm's length away from one elected official having all the control. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can structure it, and there's a lot of different ways you can negotiate it. But until you change that framework, I truly and honestly do not believe that the results will change.
So it would have to be management and structure for to be considered a takeover. Is that?
Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't hear
That
you.
would, it would have to be management and structure. In other words, if
You're probably not going to change the narrative if that's what you're asking. If that's what you're asking,
Okay.
I'm looking at a management structure, but you probably won't ever change the narrative. It's kind of like the dog bill that was the hot dog. It turned into the hot dog bill. You're not going to change that narrative, you know. So,
all right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, last one, Mr. Bodie.
Mr. Senator, is it not true that based upon Skytrax, which grants the world's awards for airports, that Atlanta is number 50 out of the 100 that's on the list, and out of the 500 that they surveyed, and out of the 17,678 commercial airlines in the country. So therefore, Atlanta Airport is being ran pretty well. Is that not true?
the representative knows what he speaks in citing that article. I'm not familiar with it, but it's no question there's plenty of good things to talk about with the airport.
You have no more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Stick close. Mr. Cardwell.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before the committee and the ladies and gentlemen in the audience. I'm consumer investigator Dale Cardwell. I'm a consumer advocate and founder of the consumer research and referral business known as Trust Dale. I moved to Atlanta in 1996 to work with Clark Howard in the consumer unit of WSB. I've spent 33 years protecting people and getting to the bottom of very complicated situations. When you air stories that make a difference in people's lives, viewers recognize that difference and they are motivated to call you. That's what happened in 1996 when sources started calling and I developed an intense interest in the way contracts were bid and awarded at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Over the years, I've spoke both on the record and off the record with dozens of airport employees and vendors who have suffered and have lost jobs or have been shut out of jobs because of heavy-handed and politicized approach to airport management. I'm here today to share 3 clear examples of how the City of Atlanta has not served the interest of its citizens and the traveling public when it comes to governing the airport. Examples that represent systemic problems that should be addressed. I'll start with the premise, promoted by the city for decades, that city airport management has created and secured jobs for minority and disadvantaged businesses. And without that continued oversight, that disadvantaged community would suffer great harm. Allow me to quote from a backgrounder on the City of Atlanta's Affirmative Action Program released by Mayor Bill Campbell's office, October 31st, 2000, which is Appendix A in the handout. The author states, under the Campbell administrations, the program has emerged as a national model with more than 1,000 businesses representing 112 different industries in Atlanta, which have been certified through the Equal Business Opportunity Program, or MFBE program, as it's also known. Over the course of the program, contracts and subcontracts awarded to minority and female businesses have amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars. The city's program required 30 to 35% of the value of airport contracts to be awarded to minorities and female-owned businesses. At the time this statement was released, Mayor Campbell and the city administration was under federal investigation that included allegations of bid rigging. This committee is no doubt aware that investigation resulted in numerous convictions and guilty pleas related to corruption. Our WSB investigations, as well as those conducted by other news outlets and law enforcement officials, found contracts being awarded to bidders who had no more capital invested in their businesses than the simple cost of printing business cards. While the intent of the EBO legislation seemed to be intended for good, the city faced a chicken and an egg scenario. It was virtually impossible to meet the 35% goal because there were not enough minority vendors that had the minimal experience required to meet the specifications to joint venture with prime contractors. This created a need to nurture inexperienced contractors, but that, in large part, did not happen. Instead, the city awarded contracts to shell companies, companies with no experience, and worse, no intent to earn the experience that would have grown the minority contracting community. My sources in the construction field, including Randy Askey of Continental Pipe, concluded that the city of Atlanta had turned Hartsfield-Jackson into a virtual, quote, speed trap, unquote, where travelers paid inflated ticket prices, parking prices, and concession prices to cover the cost of the 35% markup on virtually all airport construction and vending. According to Mr. Askey, the city had effectively eliminated hundreds of legitimate competitors around the country from bidding on airport contracts because they knew that the fix was in Atlanta. My extensive experience in observing this scenario is that the fix continues to this day, and the current news articles support that. Through it all, the city fought to maintain the illusion that its minority and female business enterprise program was not only legitimate, but a national model. That claim was put to the test and ultimately exposed as false when, in my capacity at WSB, I filed an open records request asking for copies of annual reports required by city code that were to be delivered to the city council and mayor's office attesting to the success of the city's EBO program. Specifically, we wanted to know how many of those 1,000 plus registered minority businesses the city boasted of actually got a contract. And we wanted to know the value of those contracts. You'll see that open records request in Appendix B of the handout. The Office of Contract Compliance, the department charged with the responsibility of creating those reports, told us it did not maintain the information in the form we requested. You'll see the response as Appendix C. In other words, they had no reports to support their claim that the program was effective, much less a national model. It started me thinking and digging. Why would the city not have records showing the success of the program? My conclusion as a consumer advocate after more than 2 decades of analysis is that the city was creating immense wealth for a very limited number of politically connected constituents and campaign contributors. The common word is cronies. When we exposed this sham, and you'll see my report as Appendix D in your handout, several everyday citizens expressed their concerns. In a story broadcast on WSB November 14th, 2000, the city produced 23 contracts which did show dozens of companies getting work with the city. But critics told us at the time, without an accounting of all the city's contracts, the program was open to favoritism and abuse. One of those men is Larry Miller, a black entrepreneur who told us he had been trying to get work from the city since 1979. Miller said, quote, "You must know somebody in order to get a contract with the city." He continued, "It's a shame I'm standing right here on MLK and we're talking about black on black discrimination, and we fought so hard to dispel discrimination against blacks and whites, and now we're talking about blacks discriminating against blacks." This brings me to my second example of why this committee should take a hard look at how the airport is governed. It's the story of a minority contractor named Barbara Fouch. Ms. Fouch was a model, but most importantly, in the early 70s, a close friend of Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson. Court records show Ms. Fouch was given a minority contract without competitive bid and based on zero merit to receive a substantial portion of proceeds earned from the lucrative enterprise of advertising to travelers on kiosks and advertising signs inside the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Court records also show Ms. Fouch had no Atlanta employees, had no presence whatsoever in Atlanta, but incredulously held her contract position as the minority disadvantaged business with the prime contractor and the city for more than 30 years. Think about that for a moment. This incredibly lucrative contract that should have earned the city millions upon millions of dollars was never rebid over the course of 30 plus years. The reason this singular example is so important is because this contract was preserved like a sentry at the gate over the course of 5 mayoral terms: Maynard Jackson, Andrew Young, Bill Campbell, Shirley Franklin, and Kasim Reed. During the term of this contract, the city chose to ignore a standard feature included in most airport advertising contracts, which is called a minimum annual guarantee. You see, airport advertising revenues rise and fall, but most cities deflect the ebb and flow by requiring a minimum annual guarantee in trade for rewarding the contract. Atlanta never required this from the prime contractor or Ms. Fouch, which resulted in the loss of millions of dollars of revenue to Hartsfield-Jackson. Appendix E. The popular weekly newspaper known as the Sunday Paper summed it up appropriately in 2010. Appendix F. The author, Stephanie Ramage, wrote, quote, "There's nothing disadvantaged about Barbara Fouch, who was given the airport contract without a bid in 1980 and kept it until 2002. Not only does Fouch own and live in a posh home in Beverly Hills, California, but she owns 30% of Clear Channel Airports of Georgia, that part of the Clear Channel Airport Advertising, a company that made more than $69 million during Fouch's unusually long tenure as the holder of the airport advertising contract. An airport bid competitor, Corey Airport Advertising, successfully sued the city in 2011, convincing a federal court jury to unanimously determine the city intentionally discriminated against Corey and awarded the company a $17.5 million judgment. The city and Mayor Kasim Reed felt intense pressure to settle the suit and did so for a payment to Corey Airport Services of approximately $4 million. In full disclosure, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals later nullified the jury verdict by determining that Corey and his company, as a white-owned enterprise, was clearly discriminated against, but was not part of a protected class, which included race, religion, national origin, sex, age, or physical or mental disability. In other words, the 11th Circuit determined that it's allowable to violate the constitutional rights of honest, hardworking Americans if they don't belong to a group who have been proven to be systematically discriminated against in the past. This meant the city of Atlanta had carte blanche to continue to award inflated contracts to preferred vendors. Despite the best efforts of companies intending to deliver the city and patrons of Hartsfield International Airport the best services for the most competitive prices. Fact number 3. Following the Campbell convictions and the Corey verdict, the city had a problem. Because it had not fostered an environment of small businesses growing into enterprises capable of fulfilling the 35% quota requirement, it had to find another way of capturing the 35% of money generated by airport construction and vending contracts. The brilliant solution was to stop pretending to foster the creation of hundreds of minority enterprises that could grow into fulfilling the quota, but instead distribute the tens of millions of dollars worth of contracts among a hand-picked group of minority contractors and campaign contributors who would bid on virtually every airport concessions contract. This chart, which is Appendix G in the handout, has never been seen before this year. And what it represents is the brilliant manner that Kasim Reed and the people who were bidding on airport contracts essentially broke apart all of the RFPs. And they all got together and they bidded, as you'll see, with color codes on percentages of virtually every contract on every concourse of the airport. So that instead of one company taking a shot at one bid, about 10 or 11 companies bid on everything. And you know what? They got everything. It was brilliant. These are wealthy companies. These are people that have been in business for years and years. These are multi-millionaires. And they all gave heavily to Kasim Reed's campaign. And part of the reason that this never really took effect or took hold in Atlanta is because it's hard to visualize. When you read the AJC and they're telling you this story about handfuls of friends of Kasim Reed getting together and bidding on virtually everything, it's hard to really see that until you see someone put it on a chart and color code it. And that's really disturbing. Here's an analogy. Imagine you're standing at a gate, hoping to gain entrance into the city's lucrative panorama of contracts. There's a combination lock on that gate, controlled by the Office of Contract Compliance, that determines if you are a qualified bidder. The city has become masterful at setting the lock in such a manner that only the bids of favored vendors will cause the tumblers to fall into place and the gate to open. I referenced earlier that the city and the airport do not measure the Equal Business Opportunity Program in a way that would allow insight into its performance. So, back in October of 2018, I filed another open records request. And I asked the city to provide any evidence at all that the distribution of money is lifting all boats, or some boats. Give me some indication of what you've been claiming for decades to be so effective. Well, you know what? They told me that they would give me what they had in 7 to 10 business days. You know what? That coincides with the end of the session. They're supposed to give it to you in 3 days, and it's supposed to be readily available. So I took my reporter skills and I did something that I would do. I took all the paperwork that they'd given me over the years and the months, and I had 11 different databases that had never been merged. The city didn't bother to merge them because I suspect the city knows what those databases would show. I merged all the databases of the disadvantaged business enterprises, the female business enterprises, the black-owned business enterprises, the Hispanic-owned enterprises, and I put them all together, and I discovered that there are 3,794 companies that go through the intense effort to file as a disadvantaged or minority-owned business. Of that 3,700 companies that have gone to the trouble to do that, in 2017, the most recent year we have records, 304 of those companies received payment, or 8%. $178,666,000. 43 of those companies earned $125,803,722. Or 1.1% of the 3,794 companies earned 70% of the money. Why would the city not know that? Why would the city not want to know that? Why would the city not want to know if a small company that's struggling and trying to get ahead, why would the city not want to know if they actually did get a contract or did get ahead? My conclusion after years of searching and reviewing this is because the city operates the airport like a piggy bank. And they've gone to the piggy bank one too many times, okay? Here's my point. As a longtime investigative journalist, I've found over and over there's value in oversight. The City of Atlanta's governance of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport essentially rests with the judgment of one person, the mayor of Atlanta. My 30-plus years of experience teaches that there is value in collaboration and separation of powers. I've observed this airport for many, many years, and I've studied its origins. It's my conclusion that maximum efficiency and growth for the state would benefit from a robust examination of how to distribute the responsibility for the state's largest economic engine across several diverse interests. And I should note that after I spoke to the study committee in the Senate that brought this bill forward in the Senate, Mr. Highsmith of the city took the podium and he said that he was going to, in the next session, rebut virtually everything that I had said. That meeting came and Mr. Highsmith chose not to for some reason. And so I sent him an email back on March the 11th, and I also sent an email to the mayor and to the Office of Contract Compliance. And I said, here are my notes. Here's what I said that day. And you pledged that you were going to tell people where I'm wrong. And I said, please, before I continue, tell me where I'm wrong. I've never gotten a response from Mr. Highsmith. And even though I invited the mayor to provide data and documentation how the governing of the airport has been helping more than just a handful of very, very wealthy politically connected people, I'm yet to receive any response from those parties. That concludes my comments, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone would like to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowell, thank you for being here. A couple of questions about the procurement practices. I know there's a state procurement standard, Title 36, that sort of lays out some practices the state requires for state entities. It sounds like these are not being followed at the airport level. I do want to ask you by comparison, there's a very robust, however, minority participation MBE program at the federal level. And at the federal level, there's a requirement as a prime contractor that 51% of the work be actually performed by the prime entity themselves, not by a subcontractor. Is there any requirement like that in the airport's procurement?
Yes, they do track who gets the money as a prime and who gets the money as a sub. And they do present really colorful, simple charts that show that 30 to 35% of the money, of the gross funds, are going to organizations that meet that. What they won't show you is the percentage of money that's going to what percentage of companies. In fact, for 2017, the third highest recipient of city money under this program was a company called the Pratt Group. And we all know that earlier in March, Jeff Jafari, its principal, was indicted. And so the third highest earner in that program is now under federal indictment as part of the current investigation of the airport.
If it's a consulting contract or a services contract, though, is there any evidence that 51% of the work is being performed by the actual employees of those entities, or is their revenue tend to be passed through markup and management costs?
According to the rules of the city charter, the companies are supposed to track, and the city is supposed to track whether those companies are getting paid and getting that work. If you ask for it, they will give you tons and tons of paper. It's very difficult to decipher what they're showing you, but it appears as though they are tracking that, and it does appear as though the percentages are going where they're supposed to.
Okay. One other question, you mentioned the idea of being disadvantaged entities. I know in the federal 8A program, which is sort of the pinnacle of disadvantaged business programs at the federal level, there's a requirement both that somebody be part of a disadvantage, that they demonstrate socioeconomic disadvantage through a protected class as well as a financial disadvantage. They have a net worth below a certain level. Is there any net worth requirement in the DBE program at the airport, to your knowledge?
It's been famously stated that Oprah Winfrey would qualify as a DBE to work inside the Atlanta system.
Okay. If I could, Mr. Chairman, one further question. Is there any, if this committee were to not act on the Senate version, but were to do something short of that, do you think mandating a rubric that's consistent with our state procurement practices as a requirement for the airport would be appropriate? Or do you think the structure set up at the airport that even with state procurement practices, it wouldn't change things?
I believe more eyes create better oversight and creates more sunlight. I applaud the city's efforts. I think that the new team in place is doing better. I think they're dedicated to doing better. The problem is you're not changing the political system or the political situation that seems to just continually perpetuate this. I think the state, along with the city, the cooperation of the city, could do a better job collectively.
Because as I think about this, I'm thinking about is there value to ensuring that state's procurement requirements be employed at the airport, or are those being employed but sort of being artfully circumvented in a way that the effect of it is getting around? Is that what you're telling us?
Yes, sir. I believe that they're artfully being deployed and dodged and circumvented. I often say that a very simplistic way to say this is the city buries into an RFP that the winning bidders must own a green tractor that was built in 1972 by Massey Ferguson. And most of the people bidding do not know that. In fact, the only people that know it are the people that are intended to get the contract.
Thank you.
Is that your last final question? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir. I've just got a couple of questions. First one will request the chart that you use, which I certainly couldn't see up there, and I really can't see any better down here. Would you mind creating one that I could read?
Yes, sir.
I would appreciate it. And next, in the interest of fairness, and I was looking and trying to go along with you, and I might have missed something, but we certainly all remember Mayor Campbell. But is it not true that when he was tried in federal court, he was only found guilty on one tax evasion charge?
Yes, sir. He was found guilty of tax evasion, and I think part of the challenge was that he was not indicted until 5 years after he had left office. And the co-conspirators who did go to prison decided to keep quiet and not cooperate in the investigation. And I think that there was significant evidence that contracts had been the contracting process had been taken advantage of, but you are correct that the only charge that stuck was tax evasion.
Thank you. One final statement in the interest of fairness. 5 years is not a long time with the feds, and memories don't get that bad in 5 years. But when the statement on the Oprah Winfrey qualifying, it was like a lot I've seen here, and I respect your opinion certainly, but a lot of this is very old information, and I think that statement was made in 2002 under the old guidelines. So there's not a lot of updated, now there's some 35-year-old talk back here. It's interesting and good reading late at night, but I don't see a lot of current day information in your report.
Yes, sir. The numbers that I referenced are from fiscal year 2016, 2017, which are the most recent years that are available. And those are the numbers that show that 1.1% of the companies get 70.4% of the money, and that the city doesn't go further to say the Pratt Group got 7,800,000 of that. I mean, as an evaluator, as an investigative reporter, I'd want to know that, and I can't for the life of me understand why the city would not want to know it unless there was a purpose for it not to be known.
Mr. Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here with us today, giving us a very thorough run through of things. I guess one question, did you get involved investigating this as you worked through WSB, or what's kind of your interest in doing this deep dive? Because I know it couldn't have been easier to do. So what is kind of your interest in this?
Well, back in 1996, I worked directly with Clark Howard, and Clark, as you know, is a travel expert. And so just simply being around him, you're going to, by osmosis, need to know what's going on at the airport and why tickets are expensive, inexpensive, what have you. But when you do consumer stories, you start getting phone calls from people that believe that you will tell their story, that you'll shine light on something that deserves to be illuminated. And what I found as a pattern is that over and over, those people who had registered as disadvantaged businesses were perplexed why they couldn't get a seat at the table, why they were not being included in those, and it really bothered me. It bothered me because it was hypocritical, what I was seeing. And most recently, and to the House member's question, I was stunned that Mayor Bottoms was involved in paying a person that was on her campaign as a deputy airport manager through airport funds under the intense scrutiny of the federal investigation. It was just like, I would stay as far away from something like that as I humanly possibly could. And when I saw that on the front page of the paper, I said, oh my gosh, you know, wouldn't you, as the person at the head of this, the captain of this ship, you would do everything to avoid, and that happened in December. And those paychecks were predated even before the people were working for the city. And it's like, that's a pretty significant red flag, in my opinion.
Thank you. I heard you say a minute ago that with oversight, more eyes are better to have, sunshine, daylight. If we didn't necessarily go along with the Senate proposal to kind of do a joint governance or change the governance, do you think maybe increased oversight through the legislature could be helpful if we're working with the, you also acknowledge that the mayor seems to try to be doing better here. Do you think maybe some of the new safeguards they've put in place along with legislative oversight could help remedy some of these problems?
I think the new safeguards are a good thing, a very positive step, but until the political system that controls those steps is changed or more oversight is brought in, I think it's going to fall back to the way it's always been.
Final question. When you said that 1% end up with 70% of the contracts, have you ever run crosstabs to see how those 1% also donated to the campaigns of Mayor Reed?
I did look at 2005, 2006, and 2007, and it was pretty clear that at least 50% of the companies that received more than 50% of the money had contributed to the mayor's campaign in those years. I am still working through the current campaign contributions, but I've looked at this under Mayor Reed, Mayor Franklin, Mayor Campbell, and I have not completed an evaluation of Mayor Bottoms. I would hope that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution would be doing that right now. But you're going to get campaign contributions from people who do jobs at the airport. It's just going to happen.
Thank you.
All right, 3 more questioners, and then we're going to wrap up this witness. James Beverly, then Representative Hughley, and then Representative Tanner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick question for you. I have 2 questions in essence. Have there been any indictments of any members of the majority companies that are doing business with the airport? So they've been, is it a general impression, not just minority companies, or DBEs, but majority companies? Do you have a number on how many of those folks have been either indicted or under investigation as well?
I've done research on that, but I'm not prepared to address that today. I wish I could. It's not something I have before me. It tends to not be the primes that are indicted.
But you don't have a figure on that?
No,
That's
sir.
just an assumption that you make without doing actual work to actually tell us what that looks like?
No, sir.
Okay. In your opinion, how many, if there is an airport takeover, how do you mitigate the risk if there's an authority that's actually overlooking the airport? How do you mitigate the risk of having bad actors intent on doing bad things by having an oversight within the authority?
I think you bring the city in as partners in the oversight, and you have a diverse political interest observing in real time, and have transparency and put together a program that, much like the mayor has done, where you can go on and see the city's checkbook and see who's getting paid. You know, I think that a person that gets business at the airport, there ought to be a file that says, yes, and I also contributed to the mayoral campaign, the city council campaigns, and this is the amount. The reason that's so difficult to track today is because the disclosures allow a company entity to contribute under the wife's name, the aunt's name. It's very difficult to see exactly where the money comes from, and that makes it very difficult to follow.
Representative Hughley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question. We spent a lot of time going over the disadvantaged business program of the city of Atlanta, and we're talking about turning this over to statewide oversight. Have you compared the program of the state? Did we do a better job at the state? Is that what you're saying?
No, ma'am, I'm not. I'm saying that a better job can be accomplished, but I'm also here to tell you corruption exists everywhere. Corruption is colorblind, and absolute power can corrupt absolutely. So the concentration of power in a smaller group or a single person tends to, in my experience, be a bigger problem than a lot of people involved in the process.
Chairman Tanner.
Thank you, and I want to echo, I want to thank you for all the work you've done over the many years of bringing these issues to the forefront. Again, I can't argue the fact that there are problems and have been problems at the airport. I think that's a fact. You're not here, though, specifically advocating for a specific type of, quote, takeover or a specific type of overview. If I hear you correctly, what you're saying is there has to be a change, there has to be oversight, there has to be transparency, and in some way the state should be involved so you have a different political entity so there's checks and balances. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely correct. I respect the wisdom of this body and the wisdom of the General Assembly to work with the city and come up with a great solution.
Since the airport, Mr. Chairman, another question. Since the airport was created, is it correct, in your knowledge, the state's never taken an active role in any type of oversight over the airport? We've never been able to compel, for instance, procurement records or information as a legislative body or as a state, unless there's a criminal investigation that the GBI or the FBI or the Department of Justice is involved in. There's never been a process for that transparency at the state level. Is that correct?
My understanding, there has not been. The FAA has oversight of the airport, but not the state.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Cardwell, for your information, your research, and for coming and sharing that with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Robert Highsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to address three brief topics, then I'm going to ask two members of the city and the airport management to come. I want to introduce them before I talk. One is the new general manager of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, John Selden. John comes to us as the former deputy director at Kennedy and has only been on the job a few months. He's a former Navy pilot, airport administrator for several years, and he'll come talk to you about his role. We also have retired Lieutenant Colonel David Wilson, former of the U.S. Air Force, who's also with us, who is the new procurement director at the airport, who was selected in a process that involved search committees formed by CEOs of several local companies, including, Mr. Chairman, UPS and Home Depot. I'm going to speak as briefly as I possibly can on three topics. The concession program that Mr. Cardwell spoke about, the FAA certification process, and the current bonded indebtedness at the airport that's currently in place. First of all, the study committee resolution, Mr. Chairman, that began the process that Senator Jones described, stated as its purpose to identify the legal barriers to the transfer of the airport governance, which the FAA governs, as Senator Jones has conceded, and the financial implications given the several $1 billion in bonded indebtedness, AA rated bonds, I might add, Mr. Chairman, that the airport currently holds. And neither the Senate Study Committee report does that, nor does Senate Bill 131 as it passed the Senate. There's not a line of it that addresses that. The Senate Study Committee report says that it's difficult, but challenging, I believe was the word, but not insurmountable to deal with the bonded indebtedness. And Senator Jones said today, and said before the Senate Transportation Committee, that the FAA can order the transfer of the bonds, and that concept was supported by testimony before the Senate Study Committee. The only bond expert that testified on Senator Jones's behalf before the Senate Study Committee was a lawyer who's now a partner at King & Spalding named Matt Nichols. At the time, he was with the Eversheds firm. And he did say that you could transfer the indebtedness, Mr. Chairman, of the airport, and there's, again, about $3 billion in bonds outstanding. But what he said that got short shrift by the committee, didn't make it into the Study Committee report, and certainly didn't make it into the bill, was that in order to do that, you have to defease the existing bonds. The bonds are not callable, meaning that you have to pay a premium to the existing bondholders to defease them. And the bonds are currently tax exempt. And under President Trump's tax reform from late 2017, you cannot do advance refunding of tax exempt debt. You have to refund it on a taxable basis. Estimates of what this would cost, Mr. Chairman, run from $1 to $125 million on the low end to $400 million potentially on the high end. And there's not a word in Senate Bill 131 about who would pay that, how it would be achieved, or what effect it would have on the current debt rating of the airport, which again is AA, the highest that an airport can achieve. The state enjoys AAA bond rating because the state isn't exposed to the vagaries, Mr. Chairman, of volatility in fuel prices. But the airport currently has some of the highest rated bonds in all of American aviation. So, and that question's just not asked. And Mr. Chairman, I submit to you that if this committee or the House Ways and Means Committee or the House Judiciary Committee that does not let a bill come out without a rigorous line-by-line procedure to answer questions like this, I submit to you that Senate Bill 131, as it passed the Senate, could not survive a process like that for the reason that I just articulated. Similarly, on the FAA certificate, there was reference to, I believe Senator Jones said it was 2013, it was actually 2016, that the Federal Aviation Administration issued regulations at 81 Federal Register 36144, Mr. Chairman, that stated exactly as you said, that in order for the airport governance to transfer, both the existing sponsor in the technical language of FAA regulations and the sponsor taking it over would have to agree. It further stated, Mr. Chairman, in Section 5 of that guidance, that the entity taking over the sponsorship should reimburse the entity losing the sponsorship for its investment. There's nothing in Senate Bill 131 that provides for that, Mr. Chairman, nothing at all. We would strongly urge this committee to consider those issues and ask the tough questions about the text of Senate Bill 131 that does not provide any answers to those two questions. Finally, Mr. Chairman, the only specific example of procurement irregularity that Mr. Cardwell cited and that has been cited in the previous process is the airport contract, advertising contract first let in 1979. In fact, Mr. Chairman, we heard a lot about what happened in the 70s and 80s in the study committee process, very little about what's happened since. The program under which those programs are let is called ACDBE, Airport Concession Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, and it is administered by the FAA in the U.S. Department of Transportation. The certifying entities who is able to participate in this program, Mr. Chairman, are GDOT and MARTA. Those are the two entities in the state that have the authority to certify that an entity is an ACDBE. So if that old saw that Senator Jones that Dale Cardwell trotted out that Oprah Winfrey could qualify, she would not have to convince anyone at the City of Atlanta about that. She would have to convince either GDOT or the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, and it's usually GDOT that does it for airport contracts, to certify the propriety of a minority contract. The one that Mr. Cardwell is complaining about that was let in the 70s probably wouldn't survive that scrutiny today, Mr. Chairman. And the epilogue to that contract is that litigation was settled between the city and the disappointed bidders a decade ago, and the city, as part of that settlement, agreed to rebid the contract. And when it was rebid, that particular disappointed bidder chose not to submit a bid. So we have Colonel Wilson, who is the new procurement director, to speak specifically about procurement processes in that arena, Mr. Chairman. But first I want to recognize Mr. Selden, who just has 3 to 4 comments that he'd like to offer, plus answer any of your questions. And of course, Mr. Chairman, having been living this since the introduction of Senator Jones's bill last session, I'm happy to answer any questions about the legalities and illegalities of what's been presented in Senate Bill 131.
Yeah, I think before we hear from Mr. Selden, we're going to pick on you a little bit.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right here, Robert.
Hello, Mr. Chairman.
First of all, congratulations to the city for hiring such fine counsel as yourself. They did a good job there.
Thank you, Mr.
Have you had a chance to see the House proposal of an oversight function by the legislature for the airport?
I have heard, Mr. Chairman, that a substitute has been prepared and perhaps distributed. I've not reviewed what may be currently before the members, Mr. Chairman.
The reason I know you to be good legal counsel is because I remember working with you last decade when you were Governor Perdue's top lawyer, and I found you to have great skill and great ability. And as I also recall, you were there in Governor Perdue's office when the legislature decided to insert ourselves into another local problem, and that was Grady Hospital. You may recall that the state decided through intervention to change and affect the governance of Grady Hospital because they were having significant problems there. Would you agree that at that point the state's insertion into a local problem produced good results because Grady's Hospital's success at this point?
Well, thank you for reminding me, Mr. Chairman, of all those years ago. The key difference between the state's involvement with Grady and this is twofold. My recollection, Mr. Chairman, is at the time Grady was in dire financial straits. Dire financial straits. And that as part of a governance transfer that didn't have the state taking over Grady Hospital, but rather had a newly constituted nonprofit board taking on Grady Hospital, that in exchange for accepting that governance change, there was a 9-figure infusion of cash into the operations of Grady Hospital to help it survive. I don't currently represent Grady Hospital, but it's my understanding that that has been very successful. The key difference here is that as I was telling Chairman Powell, the City of Atlanta's airport's debt rating, the efficiency ratings, the awards, you've all heard about those, you'll hear more about them. The debt rating, the opinion of the private municipal debt market is that this is some of the best airport debt you can buy as a bondholder. It's not AAA, it's AA rated by all 3 agencies. The airport doesn't need that infusion, and there's been absolutely nothing in the bond market or at the FAA to suggest that a state takeover would change anything for the good at Hartsfield. So while I agree, Mr. Chairman, that the Grady effort was very positive for all involved, it isn't comparable to where we stand now with Hartsfield.
So if I understood your answer correctly, the Grady insertion the insertion into Grady's governance by the state was successful, and the only difference here is we could do that without having to put any money up. Is that right?
The chairman, see, Mr. Chairman Powell, why I suggested that this bill might not have survived in the Judiciary Committee. The difference again, Chairman Fleming, is that the Grady was having problems. And other than a 40-year-old procurement, an FAA review that Mr. Selden will talk more about, and a federal investigation that hasn't yet touched any current airport vendor or airport official, there isn't anything at Hartsfield requiring or demanding or requesting that state takeover. The other thing is that the existing then governance of Grady was cooperative and receptive to the involvement of the state, again, not a state takeover, but the reconstitution of the governance to include a nonprofit board to govern the hospital. The situations, Mr. Chairman, respectfully simply aren't comparable.
So the difference would be that if this committee were to find that there are no problems or we believe there are none at the airport, we would need to take no action. But if we found that we thought there were some problems there, maybe we should do something, correct?
Well, again, Mr. Chairman, I've not seen the substitute that to which the chairman refers, but a transfer of governance of Hartsfield, which is what the bill as it passed the Senate provides, does not answer the 2 very, very serious questions. What happens to $3 billion in AA rated debt, and what happens to an FAA certificate that the FAA has said it will not transfer absent agreement and absent payment by the entity doing the takeover for those assets.
So last question, an oversight function by this legislature which would not change ownership would not delve into those 2 problems that you just mentioned, correct?
I don't know what effect it would have on the rating of that debt. I don't know, and the bond lawyers we've consulted don't have clear answers either. Bond rating agencies ask a lot of questions just based on things that get said publicly. Every time someone proposes cutting the state income tax, for example, which stands, as the chairman knows, as security for a lot of outstanding general obligation debt, that can cause, even the suggestion of it can cause rating agencies to threaten to or actually lower ratings, and that can dramatically, when you're talking about $3 billion in AA rated debt, could dramatically affect interest rates for the City of Atlanta or whomever else. We just don't know the answer to that question, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Counselor.
Chairman Knight, and then we're going to hear from Mr. Selden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Highsmith, I appreciate your comments, but going back to, I guess, the comment you had for Chairman Fleming, when it says Grady was having a problem, can you address any of the issues that we've heard today in regards to the problems that appear to be going on within the Atlanta airport? Specifically, question, are you aware of these issues, of the issues that are brought up, and specifically, and I know this is anecdotal, but we for years have heard specifically, especially in regards to concession contracts, that people would bid for those contracts and would later be called up and told, here is your minority partner, and this is the share that they will have, take it or leave it. And I've also understood anecdotally that, you know, they could be, and are you aware of, are any of those minority partners relatives or siblings of past mayors?
To answer your last question first, Mr. Chairman, I'm certainly not aware of anything that would constitute the sort of nepotism that the question suggests. Again, the minority participation rules in the concession contracts are governed by the FAA and GDOT. GDOT certifies minority vendors, and the FAA administers the ACDBE program. I would submit to you, Mr. Chairman, that there's a reason that the only specific example that was brought forth by those supporting Senate Bill 131 is an example from a contract that was led in 1980. And I can't defend for you that process, Mr. Chairman. I was 9 years old. What I can do is defend the existing process that you'll hear more about from Colonel Wilson, the minority participation components of which, again, are governed by federal and state entities, not local entities. The local entity has to comply with them, of course. As to the most recent concession litigation, everyone should know that the state has bid protests as well all the time. There was an article about a bid protest relating to petroleum products, to jet fuel. That was in the article in the paper just a few days ago. At any given moment, there are several dozen bid protests pending here in the state of Georgia. Medicaid contracts, Medicaid pharmacy benefit management contracts, road contracts, technology, IT contracts. At any moment, there are dozens of protests that are pending. And Mr. Chairman, that's a healthy part of the process. The fact that somebody files a bid protest doesn't mean that something went wrong. It may have. But the bid protest process is there to ensure that if something goes wrong, that it is addressed through an adversarial litigated process. The last time that happened, Mr. Chairman, at the City of Atlanta in its concession contracts was about 8 years ago when the concession contracts were rebid, and they were hotly litigated. There was protests and litigation before Fulton County Superior Court. All of those cases, not before entities at the city, but before judges, were either lost or were settled for nuisance amounts. And those were some of the most heavily scrutinized, hotly scrutinized contracts in the city's history. So the only specific example I can speak to is the one that Mr. Cardwell talked about, and I think I don't know anything about Barbara Fouch. I'm sorry that I don't have more to share about what happened with that contract in 1980. Finally, Mr. Chairman, as to the FAA review, Mr. Selden will speak to that more. He has experience with those in his role at Kennedy. The FAA absolutely polices expenditure of aviation funds. And the fact that the FAA is reviewing it does not mean that something has gone wrong to the extent that there should be a state takeover of the airport. It means that the FAA is doing its job. And Mr. Selden can talk about how the other airports around the country handle and react to FAA reviews that are commonplace and happen all the time and are welcome.
Robert, let's hear from Mr. Selden.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Thank you for this opportunity. I am thrilled to be here and be able to tell you about Hartsfield-Jackson. I'm John Selden. I went to the United States Naval Academy. I served 20 years active duty as a Navy pilot. I served in Operation Desert Storm. I served in the Pentagon, and I also ran a deputy commander of a naval base. I then transitioned to American Airlines as a pilot. I flew out of Kennedy, Newark, and LaGuardia for 5 years, and then I returned back to airport management, where I have 19 years of experience running airports and over 39 years of experience in aviation. As a pilot, I will tell you, I've seen many, many airports in my time, and everybody in this room, and everybody in the state of Georgia, and everybody in the city of Atlanta should be incredibly proud of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. It is a gem. The city has built that airport over a 90-year period. It has operated it, maintained it, and keeps it running like a thoroughbred racehorse right now. We are by far the most efficient large airport in the country, where 85% of our flights are on time. That's due to design. That's due to the way the city manages it and runs it. That's due to my team at Hartsfield-Jackson, city employees, and our airline stakeholders, and our federal partners. We are a team. And that team runs an incredibly efficient operation, and no other large airport can compare to it. We also are highly ranked for customer service. The experience of our passengers and our employees is rated incredibly high, 4.3 out of 5.0. We are either number 1 or number 2 in the country for customer experience, and the customer experience in our terminal and with our airline partners. Thirdly, and finally, we are the busiest passenger airport in the world at 107.4 million people, and we will broach through 110 million this year based on projections. There's a reason for that, and that reason is very easily defined. It is mentioned, I believe Senator Jones mentioned the term cost per enplanement. The city runs this airport incredibly lean. I'll give you just one example. Denver Airport, a beautiful airport, one of the top ranked airports in the country. As a matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal rated that airport number 1. We were also in the top rankings. That airport, to put a passenger on an airplane in Denver, costs Delta Airlines $11. Those are the fees due to their cost structure and their management that the airline has to pay the airport based on the enplanement of one passenger. At Hartsfield-Jackson, it's $4.81. In Charlotte, it's just under $4. We are the second, as Senator Jones referenced, most valued airport in the country. Charlotte also has a very large capital program, building terminals, so that cost is going to escalate. But we have an incredible machine. So if you were Delta Airlines, sir, and you are going to enplane 75 million people, and you are going to save $6 per passenger, that's $500 million to Delta's bottom line by operating out of Hartsfield-Jackson. And that is the reason we are the economic engine, and the tremendous growth here under city stewardship, under city management, with the great team that we have there, and the agile ability to make decisions quickly without layers and layers of government and authority to go through. That ability is key to making us so efficient. Also, we just signed a lease in 2017 with our 19-member airlines, our partners. In the lease, they wanted a line in the lease that specifies that the City of Atlanta maintains operational control and maintenance of Hartsfield-Jackson. There's a reason for that, and that's because we are so good at doing it. And then finally, in closing, this uncertainty that's created right now, the environment we're in right now, is problematic for the operation of the airport. Not only because of the airport employees, all 1,200 of them, city employees that work there and don't know their future, but secondly, it affects business investment. Maybe we'll slow down because we're unsure who's going to be running the airport and what rules we're going to have to operate under. And finally, it clouds the future. We are uncertain. Everybody who is invested in the American stock market knows the stock market likes one thing: certainty. Who's going to manage it? Who's going to run it? Who's going to have the cost structure? How do I do business? Senate Bill 131 changes that. It has created a cloud of uncertainty that we need to clear up very quickly for the citizens of Atlanta, for the people, for the residents of Georgia and the entire state and the economic engine that we are. So I'm here for any questions if there are any, sir.
You have no questions? Colonel Wilson?
question. My question, not a question, recommendation to all those that come up, while that's truly the leadership, the committee is out here to this row. So give us a glance every once in a while where we can.
So how you vote depends on whether he looks at you? Colonel Wilson, look at that guy right there.
Right there. All right. Good deal. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman, for inviting me here today. It is my pleasure to be here as your Chief Procurement Officer for the City of Atlanta. Again, my name is David Wilson II. I want to make sure my father is credited for that. And it is truly a pleasure to have been accepted into this position. We are a very dedicated department. We support not only the airport, but the entire city. That includes everybody that sits here as well that lives within the city boundaries. We practice an open and fair and competitive process. We look at all of our solicitations, we evaluate them for responsiveness, and we also work with the departments to evaluate them for responsibility, all right? We also partnered with our city council and established an independent procurement office that is embedded within our department that works through our solicitations all the way through execution of our contracts. That process, as I'm aware, does not exist at the state, for example. The state follows the same procurement process as it's built. We're all built around that same process, that ABA standard, but I believe we as the city have a more stringent and oversight and committed process. We have more transparency and more visibility in that process today. I cannot speak to what happened in the 70s. I cannot speak to what happened in the 80s, the 90s, or even the early 2000s. But I can speak that today up under Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, as well as in partnership with our city council, that our process is fair, it's open, and it's not run and operated by one individual blindly. The mayor is involved in the procurement process, but that is at the end of the process when it's time for that signature to take place. City council actually sees our requirements and they're reviewed at that level before it even gets to the mayor. That process is inclusive of both sides of the city, the legislature as well as the executive. We work in tandem to make sure that the city gets a fair, equitable, and open process. We are implementing new processes, new procedures, updating codes to match those that are consistent with best practices today. And we're implementing different processes and new things to make things more transparent and ethical. Thank you.
Chairman Fleming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any problems with the procurement process at the airport?
At this point in time, I'm not aware of any procurement problems or processes at the airport. Again, what I would like to say is the process that we utilize that supports the airport is a process that supports the entire city. We have one process. There's not a process that's separate for the airport, that's separate, and then something different for the city. We operate one procurement process.
So if there are no problems there, you would have no issues with this legislature creating an oversight process by looking into it because we're going to find no problems. Is that correct?
I believe adding an additional layer of oversight would be unnecessary, and then also add to a level of additional complexity to the process, which could potentially slow it even further, which would hurt potential businesses as well as the airport and the city itself in getting the requirements and needs that it has.
How would it hurt?
Slow the process. So now you're asking for other agencies, other entities, an additional oversight and environment to now look into something that's already looked into by our council, by our mayor, by our audit office. It is not a singular process that is done by one individual or one office. It is done by multiple offices as a team across the city.
Does the oversight by the FFA slow down your process?
The oversight by the FAA is not slow down our process. That's already embedded within our process.
But you think oversight by the state would?
I think it will be an additional measure that will now add to the process.
Thank you.
Chairman Knight.
First of all, thank you and the prior gentleman for your service to the country. In regards to the procurement process and the oversight, I would assume that I'm hearing you say there are no problems.
I'm not aware of any problems at this time, no.
Are you aware of any businesses or any people who are trying to secure a procurement of a contract with the City of Atlanta having to go through handlers or consultants in order for those, I guess, applications for contracts to be considered or to get into that procurement process?
So again, we have established and implemented an electronic procurement process. So when we post our solicitations, not only to our City of Atlanta portal, we also post those to the state portal. And so all vendors that are registered within the City of Atlanta portal, as well as the state, can see all of our solicitations and openly bid on those solicitations and provide that through our electronic portal and receive the fair shot equally, regardless of race, gender, creed, sex, origin, or et cetera.
Okay, so again, I want to make sure my question is, are you aware of once somebody is made an application or, on your portal to for a contract, are there any requirements, either known or published or not, that you need a consultant to help you travel through the process in order for you to be successful in getting that contract?
No, there are no requirements for consultants to help businesses to develop their proposals to submit them through the portal, or develop their proposal to submit through the portal.
Chairman Hawkins.
Well, thank you for your work and coming here today. We've heard a lot about oversight of the FFA. I guess my question is this: who decided to hire Marva Lewis as the Deputy General Manager of the airport?
That would be a question not for me, as I was not here in the city at that time to be able to answer that question.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. You have no more questions. Chairman Tanner, do you have a substitute you want to present to the committee?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If you would, come up and present from the podium, please.
I'm going to spend all of my time, Mr. Chairman, looking out at the members of the committee because I'm looking forward to a positive vote, and I'm going to keep an eye on Representative Williams to make sure he gives me that. Mr. Chairman, I first want to take a moment to thank the Speaker, the leadership team in the House, also the Minority Leader and Dean Smyrie for their work, and I also want to specifically thank Governor Kemp for his leadership in helping put together the substitute that's here today in front of you. It's LC 392389S. This is a proposed committee substitute to SB 131. This substitute does several things. I will walk you through it, and I believe other members of the Rules Committee may also want to make comment on it. I want to first say on the section 1 around the airport that I have in my questions and in conversations, I've often said that I believe those of us that find ourselves in political office and those of us that find ourselves in positions of responsibility need to always have measured approaches to problems. Sometimes I find that the government swings the pendulum too far, and we can think of a lot of examples where that's occurred. And there's some problems you really just don't want to completely own, quite frankly. But I do think that we've heard enough testimony today, and I appreciate Senator Jones and the work he's done and has brought a lot of issues forward that do require some action. So Section 1 of the substitute would create a major airport legislative oversight committee. This would not just be for Atlanta. This would actually take in 10 airports across Georgia that are commercial airports. This committee would be composed of the following members: be the chairs of the House and Senate Transportation Committee. That would be the chairs of both appropriations committees. Be 4 members appointed by the Speaker, 2 of which would reside in a county with a commercial airport that would be affected by this, or an adjacent county to that airport, and the same 4 members under the same conditions by the Lieutenant Governor. The chair of the committee would be appointed from within the committee membership by the Speaker of the House. much like Martok is today, and the lieutenant governor would appoint the vice chair of that committee. The authority of the committee, they would have the authority to evaluate public safety, prudent, legal, and accountable expenditure of public funds, equitable and transparent procurement practices for the provision of services at the airport, and efficient operation. They would also have the ability to have subpoena power. They'd be able to require witnesses to testify and to compel certain documents to be presented to the committee. The state auditor, GDOT, the Attorney General, the Department of Public Safety, and the Department of Economic Development would assist the committee when requested by the committee. They may also establish citizen advisory committees to act in an advisory role only, one or more committees as they deem necessary. I believe this oversight committee is a step in the right direction, again, to ensure a measured response, not a political one, to this issue. And again, this, in listening to testimony today, this in no way would require the airport to come to this legislative oversight committee and ask permission to change policy, to do bids, procurement processes, or anything. It would just be much like Martok serves today. It would have the power to make sure that things were being done in an ethical and legal manner, and if they saw issues, they could take the next step to investigate that and even call in the Attorney General if they felt necessary. So I think we could avoid some of the situations where we find out about activity many years later. This bill also does several other things. Part 2 of the bill of the substitute Section 2, or Part 2, Section 2-1, this part of the bill is the exact language that passed under House Bill 447, which was carried by the governor's floor leader and was the jet fuel tax exemption bill. It does two main things. It extends the exemption date from June 30th, 2019 to June 30th, 2039, and it imposes a 0.005 cent tax on distributors. Again, that is exactly the same language that passed this House already prior to crossover day. Next in the bill, you have House Bill 511, which is the product of the work from the Transit House Governance and Funding Commission over the last 2 years. Members of this House and also President Pro Tem of the Senate, Butch Miller, was also a member of that commission, have met all over the state and brought forward recommendations and legislation that we introduced as House Bill 511, which does away with Greta, replaces it with the Department of Mobility and Innovation, streamlines bureaucracy around the delivery of transit services, specifically across rural Georgia. Again, this is the same language that passed the House prior to crossover day that's in this legislation. Section 3-2 is new language. This deals with the around the 10-year plan required in House Bill 170. One of the things that we've heard from a lot of our members that have been concerned about hotel motel tax money and other expenditures in GDOT and how those funds are being used. There was, during the negotiations with the Senate and House Bill 170, a requirement put in that GDOT would bring a 10-year plan that would have to receive the approval of the House and Senate Transportation Committees prior to session ending and should be prior to the appropriations process. What that has really developed into, though, is just a percentage bucket list of we're spending this percentage in each bucket of expenditures. Really does not provide very much legislative oversight, which was the intent, I think, of that language. This changes that to require that when we're talking about those fees outside motor vehicle fuel dollars, that hotel motel tax money, heavy vehicle fees, that GDOT will be required to specifically give a list of the projects where those dollars are going to be utilized, and that there will have to be a 10-year plan approved prior to the appropriations process. Again, making sure the intent of that always was that to make sure those dollars were being spent in the correct manner, that we were telling our citizens that we were going to use those. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions. Again, I believe this is a very measured response, and it's to deal with a lot of transportation policy issues that this General Assembly has been talking about, quite frankly, for multiple years. Senator Jones and I have worked together last session on some pretty difficult issues around landfills and fees, and I find him to be a very reasonable senator that I look forward to continuing to have conversations with between the House and Senate. But I would propose this at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman, in the form of a motion. And I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Representative Huber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You said this appears that there are several other airports that are going to be subject to this first part. What is that list? You said there are 10. What are those?
Atlanta, Savannah International, Augusta, Columbus, Valdosta, Albany, Southwest Regional, Brunswick, Middle Georgia Regional, Macon, DeKalb, Peachtree, and Athens.
My only concern, isn't it true, Mr. Chairman, is that we've just learning about this and we have no idea the effect or the concerns that our locals would have about this.
Well, again, this is a oversight committee. This is not creating policy. This is not creating a requirement that they have to check with this authority or this committee prior to doing something. I think you'll find the MARTOC Oversight Committee, which is very similar to this, has worked very well. It has given us a MARTA organization that we're all proud of, that we've embraced bipartisanly over the last several years. So I think this is a measured response. Again, hopefully you would agree this would be better than a takeover of the airport.
I certainly agree that this is a measured response and it's better than a takeover of the Atlanta airport, but people in the country would say, now you just going to Midland.
Chairman Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Tanner, thank you for your work on this. You know, this whole discussion, we've heard comments regarding Hartsfield International Airport. I mean, world's largest or busiest airport. And I would tell everyone, as it goes in regards to aviation, that nobody's trying to hurt aviation. In fact, if there is a blemish there that is causing a great asset, and not only in Hartsfield, but everywhere in the state, this is something that truly needs to be addressed. That's not how we operate in this state. I don't think that's what our citizens expect of us. Mr. Chairman, my specific question, though, and I've made no secret of this, I even regards to questions on the floor, this goes back to the original bill of 447 and to the exemption on jet fuel. I like the mechanism that we have here. I've been telling everyone that. But I do have concerns about the amount that we are replacing the 1 penny with, which is under FAA rules is guaranteed that the state must at least put that minimum back into aviation. And it appears that this bill is replacing it with a half a penny excise tax that only puts about $3 million back in. In fact, when you look at the fiscal note specifically says in the analysis that similarly a portion of the effect of the exemption from the sales tax, 1 percentage point out of the 4% state tax, would be a reduction in aviation dedicated funds. This is the fiscal note. I'm reading from the fiscal note from 447. In addition to that, the current amount that is dedicated is around $11.5 million. That's one penny, and that's actually that's the low estimate. It's almost $12 million on the high estimate for just the next year. That would be replaced with only $3 million. So it seems to me that we are not looking after our general aviation around the state. It seems like with this exemption, we are going backwards. And I'll make one final comment and let you respond. But according to the fiscal note and the 20-year sunset, we would be giving over and this is conservative, $1,071,000,000 tax credit on the 4 pennies of jet fuel. But I would remind these members and yourself that in the special session, we permanently gave away or exempted the local portion of $25,400,000, which if you do that out over 20 years, that's $509 million. So it seems to me that we're giving away a lot, and we want to be business friendly and making sure that our aviation in Georgia continues to be a competitive place. But it seems to me that we are doing this at the expense of all of other Georgia general aviation airports.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and you and I have had a lot of conversations around this issue, and as Chairman of Transportation, I work very closely with our Airport Association, which represents the airports around the state, and there is great need there for financial assistance from the state. Some are not eligible for other funds, so I don't disagree. Governor Deal last year put in money from other sources other than jet fuel to help fund local airports. I will say, though, that like I mentioned to you before, this is not the end of the conversation around this issue. I'm confident that when this legislation goes back to the Senate, that we'll have additional conversations around a lot of parts of this bill. And in talking with the governor's office, I'm confident that he is prepared to have those further conversations, including about that amount, to make sure that we have a good system in place to take care of all of our airports. So, but I don't disagree that there are additional dollars needed to help support our local airports.
Representative Beverly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of lines. One is on this, on the idea of the special local options sales tax on line 465 through 473. Specifically, any amount of money that is in excess of the maximum cost of transit projects should be given to another authority or an appropriate council. What is that? What do you anticipate that being? Like, so on line, specifically line 470, or the appropriate council, what agency or what is that?
That is, that's under the 511 that passed. Give me just 1 second to look at that. This is around the issue of the mobility councils being able to fund or approve the funding of a single county transit splash. Again, it was in the original 511. It's not new language, but the idea there is just like we did with the ATL last year. We set up the ability for single counties to go through the ATL board to get approval to do a single county transit splash. Last year in 930, we set up the ability for one or more counties outside the ATL to do the same thing, but they had to partner together. This year in House Bill 511, because hearing from Chatham, Savannah, hearing from Athens, Clark, who want to take advantage of this, their counties around them are fairly small and don't really have an interest. So the idea is to set it up where the mobility councils could be a part of that conversation.
And I have one more question, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind. The second question is around this new department that's created, the Department of Mobility and Innovation. And do you have an actual figure how much that's going to cost to create a new department? Because it looks like that Health and Human Services, all transportation responsibilities from the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services, Behavioral Health, Department Disabilities, and Community Health shall be transferred to this new department, a year from now, July 1, 2020. That's a huge department. And is there an associated cost with this, and where's that money going to come from to actually fund this new department?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not a huge cost because those employees already exist in state government. It's only the portion of it that relates to rural transit within those departments. So it's not the entire department. All it is just at GDOT, for instance, I believe there's 17 employees that deal with rural transit. Department of Health, there's 33 employees that deal with, so you're talking about 50 some odd plus employees dealing with rural transit that would come together in this new department. It's streamlining the process, but again, Greta goes away, replacing it with this. All the employees that's currently employed in those other departments would be moved over to this department, but not hiring new employees and not moving the entire department over.
All right, 2 more questions and we're going to wind it up. Representative Williams.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, would you clarify something for me? I didn't get it clear. The commercial airports, the other 9 or 10 in this state, have we talked to their authorities, and how do their local delegations feel about this? I'm particularly interested in Savannah.
Right. Okay. I've not talked to them. This has been developing fairly quickly over the last day or so, so I know we'll have those conversations, but again, the idea here is that we should not just put all of our focus just on one airport, that this would encompass all of our more major commercial airports, and the legislation determines that by takeoff and landings in the legislation. But I'm sure we'll have those conversations, but I have not personally had those conversations. But I want to make sure you understand I have been looking at you the entire time.
That's why I believe what you said.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Chairman Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Tanner, thank you for your work on this. 2 things. First of all, as someone from the Augusta area, I have no concerns about there being any oversight of our airport there because I don't think we have the problems. I think if we did develop some problems, I'd want somebody to be able to interject. Number 2, I share the same concerns as Chairman Knight does about the funding for general aviation airports around the state and what the tax portion of this bill does to that. It's my understanding that our friends in the Senate have also expressed that concern by making a change where there would be more resources for several of those airports that we're speaking of. My request would simply be to you or anybody else on this committee, quite often big issues end up in conference committees.
Yes, sir.
And if anybody on this committee or yourself ends up on a conference committee, I'm going to vote for this, even though it has what I think is a low amount in it for that funding. I would ask that we consider doing a little better for general aviation around the state. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I want to recognize Chairman Hatchett for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we do pass Senate substitute to SB 131 LC 392389S.
All right, there's a motion and a second. All in favor say aye. Understand that this is a standing committee now, and now it actually goes to rules for rules to consider whether to put it on the floor or not. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank y'all for yes, sir. What's that? Okay. Yes, sir. From a procedural standpoint, it's just like any other bill. We haven't decided whether it'll be structured or modified structured or whatever it is, but if it's certainly open rule, it can be amended on the floor. If it's modified open, it can be amended on the floor. If it's modified structured, it can be amended only through rules, and if it's structured, it can't be amended. That decision has not yet been made, but it will be just like any other bill that comes to rules. Yes, sir, and we'll see each other at 9 in the morning. We're adjourned.